Welcome, engineers. My name is Travis IQ, and today I'm going to show you how to answer exam questions related to confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Let's go. Join me in the void as we begin answering some of these questions. Here's the first one. A network administrator is tasked with improving the performance and reliability of the company's cloud infrastructure by deploying a load balancer. The load balancer will distribute incoming network traffic across multiple servers to prevent overload and reduce latency. So basically, they've described a load balancer here and given a load balancer use case in a cloud infrastructure. Great. Which of the following fundamental security requirements does this project primarily fulfill? So one of the things that I like to do, especially in these CompTIA style or other certification exam style exam questions, is I like to kind of, for myself, remove all of the fluff. So my first thought is this a cloud question? It really isn't a cloud question. Is this a network traffic question or a network access question? It really isn't. It's really describing a load balancer here and then asking which of the following fundamental security requirements does this project primarily fulfill? So it's basically saying we have a load balancer and we have a use case. What does a load balancer do to facilitate this use case in the context of the confidentiality, integrity, and availability triad, right? And so does a load balancer facilitate privacy? No, a load balancer isn't going to facilitate privacy, not in the traditional sense of a load balancer. You could say, well, Travis, there are multiple load balancer deployment types, and they're starting to aggregate technology to make load balancers more useful in this sense. I agree. Actually, I would say that the more knowledge you have a lot of the times related to some of these questions, the more difficult it becomes to answer the question, right? So for someone like me who has a deep knowledge set and has seen load balancers deployed with additional functionality, I might say, hey, a load balancer could do this, right? But it's not actually the primary functionality of the load balancer in this context. So it really isn't facilitating privacy. A load balancer isn't acting to conduct integrity checks. So it's really not going to conduct integrity checks, B. And it's certainly not going to facilitate end-to-end encryption. Again, your load balancer could act as a VPN endpoint as well. But in this case, we are trying to answer what is the best security tenant in the CIA Triad that is being described by the situation here. So confidentiality isn't described by the situation here. They've given you no additional context to tell you that the load balancer in this case could do any of these things. So we really have to assume that it is the base case load balancer. And in that case, if we've eliminated A, B, and C here, what we can also say then is D is likely the answer. And then if I look at D, availability. Right? So what the load balancer is trying to do here is it's trying to prevent overload, which what would happen if your system were overloaded with requests, you wouldn't get a response. So that would no longer allow your system to be available. And reduce latency. Right? Reduced latency is the time between the responses that you receive after you initiate a request. And so that's also increasing the availability because it's making sure that the latency is as low as possible, which means you're getting responses more quickly, which means you are getting a higher degree of availability. So in every sense of the word here, this load balancer is facilitating availability, and the goals that it's asking you to facilitate with preventing overload and reducing latency also relate to that availability tenant. And so really the only answer here, or the most correct answer here, is D, availability. And that's how I think about these questions. I'm going to give you that context for all of these questions moving forward. Let's take a look at the next question. A company's human resource department maintains a file share containing sensitive employee records, including personal information, PII data, that's what this is referring to, payroll details, and performance evaluations. This would be basically intellectual property associated with the company that they wouldn't want released. To protect this data, access permissions are configured to follow the principle of least privilege, ensuring that only authorized personnel have the minimum necessary access to perform their job duties. So before I even get to the question that it's asking related to the scenario above, I'm going to have a difficult time doing what I normally do, which is pulling out the most important information, because I see things like file shares, PII data, least privilege. And so this could be related to access permissions, it could be related to data types, it could be related to network file sharing. So what I really need to do is I need to say, okay, there's a lot of information here that could be relevant to a CompTIA style or a certification style exam question. I need to look at the question and the answers and to see what they're actually trying to ask so that I can start parsing that information out. Which of the following security concepts is the primary reason for implementing this access control strategy? Okay, so now I'm not interested in the access control principle. I'm not interested in the data types. I'm really not interested in the mechanism through sharing. I'm really interested in what I am doing to maintain the access to this file system or this file share, and what type of principle that's addressing in the underlying CIA triad. So I would argue that it's probably something like file sharing, and least privilege is going to give me some context here. So which of the following security concepts is the primary reason for implementing this control strategy? First of all, if I am implementing least privilege, I'm not making this available to everyone, so I'm really not facilitating the concept of availability. Again, if we go back to even our previous question or some of the subsequent questions, you'll notice that I would say you could make a case for availability here. You could say we are making it available only to those who need availability, but that's really not the tenet of availability here, which is making data accessible. Yes, it's a file share, but I'm describing a system that is controlling access to these files to make sure that they don't get in the hands of someone who does not need access to them or someone malicious, for example. So that being said, I haven't described any tenets of integrity either here, right? I'm not checking the data types. I'm not checking for data consistency across domains. I'm not comparing data to previous versions. There's no integrity check described here. So I haven't described any integrity checks. I really haven't described any principles of maintaining availability. And non-repudiation, which is the principle of ascribing data transmitted to a unique individual, and we'll talk more about non-repudiation in a subsequent video. It's really not describing transmission of data or ascribing the transmission of that data, the production of that data to a specific individual or system. So it's not really describing non-repudiation here either. You notice that I do something here, which is I start with the no's and go to the yeses. It's easier for me to do given that I have a broad knowledge of this topic in space. But either way, what I would do is I would start with the no's. And if I can't eliminate all three in a 4 example question like this, then I can at least eliminate a few, and then I can start describing the answer based upon the 1 or 2 or 3 that I haven't said explicitly no to. Anyway, in this case, I actually have just narrowed it down to a single CIA tenet, which is confidentiality. And so what we're doing here is we are describing maintaining confidentiality of data through the concept of least privilege. And if you remember in the previous video, I actually talked about the concept of least privilege related to confidentiality. Just briefly, I mentioned it. We'll talk about access control policies, least privilege being one of them in a subsequent video, but that's what it's describing here. And you don't necessarily have to know what least privilege is to make the educated guess or to make a pretty clear assertion as to which CIA triad example it is here. But if you did know least privilege, you do understand PII and intellectual property, you do understand file shares, you really can put a complete picture here together and say confidentiality is really the tenet that it's describing here. A shared file system where we are only giving access to those individuals who need it and the minimum amount of access required as a result of the type of information that's stored on that file share. So we've answered question number 2. Let's go. Let's keep going. All right, next question. An e-commerce organization processes numerous transactions daily, requiring safeguards to prevent accidental or unauthorized purchases. To ensure the accuracy and reliability of transaction data, the organization implements measures such as input validation, order confirmation prompts, and transaction verification processes to minimize errors and fraudulent activity. Again, before I even get to the question, I notice here that there is a lot of information related to certification exam objectives. Things like numerous transactions daily, lots of transactions going on, unauthorized or preventing unauthorized purchases, accuracy, reliability of data, input validation, transaction verification, confirmation prompts, minimizing errors. So I see a lot of keywords here that might indicate to me this might be a component of the question that's valuable to me. This might be a component of the question that's valuable to me. So I immediately realize I need to know what the context of this question is. And since we're at question 3 here, you know that the context of the question is the CIA Triad, but you won't know that if we were going in a traditional certification exam, for example. They're not going to be a pile of questions related to CIA back to back to back, right? But in this case, there are. And so I need to come down here and I need to look at which of the following, right? I need to say, give me the question. Which of the following security concepts should the organization apply to protect against erroneous purchases? So not only is the question saying which of the following security concepts, so it is related to CIA, but it's not just saying the confidentiality, integrity, and availability triad. It's actually saying I want to protect against a very specific thing that was identified in the question above. There were a number of components identified in the question above. Input validation, transaction verification, error minimization. But what they're actually describing here is a new set. They've said, hey, we've done all this stuff. How does this environment that we described here help us protect against erroneous purchases? And what can I implement to potentially protect against erroneous purchases? I want to point out here, when we go down into the answers, there really isn't a clear answer. And then you're like, Travis, why did you present a question that doesn't have an explicit or very clear answer? And the reason that I did this is these types of questions pop up in certification exams all the time. Why do they pop up in certification exams all the time? The reason they do is when you're in an environment, a business environment or an application development environment or security environment, there isn't always a one-stop shop clear answer. There isn't a time when you're in a meeting with 3 or 4 other professionals, you go, this is a confidentiality issue. We need to solve it immediately, right? You get into a meeting and you say, hey, we're having issues with erroneous purchases, hopefully on our test network, on our test implementations. What's the best solution? What should we be doing here? Or what should we be looking for to potentially eliminate this issue of erroneous purchases? So you're going to get questions like this, and there isn't going to be a 100% clear answer, but typically what you'll see in here, and maybe in this question it might have been better to put in, what's the best, right, security concept to address the issue of erroneous purchases? So let's go through the available answers here. So privacy. Is keeping the data private going to prevent erroneous purchases? No. Right? If we encrypt the data and then decrypt it on our end and then have the server process the request, just because the data was encrypted in transit or private through whatever other mechanism you want to implement, an offline transaction, whatever you want to say to maintain privacy, that doesn't do anything to prevent erroneous purchases. So privacy doesn't really help us here. Again, availability, allowing for the request to come through and have low latency and not generate a lot of errors and get responses, right? The availability of this service does nothing to prevent erroneous transactions. So availability really doesn't help us here either. Now we come down to integrity and confidentiality checks. So I would argue that confidentiality is similar to this privacy request. And so we have a very similar answer, or a very similar no, in the sense that maintaining the confidentiality of the data, again, does not prevent erroneous transactions. If I'm going to make an erroneous purchase, if Travis is going to make an erroneous purchase to the server, or is going to send a transaction that's an erroneous purchase to the server, this is a purchase server, whatever you want to call it. That's an odd nomenclature, but it's descriptive nonetheless. So if I'm going to send this transaction here to try and purchase something and manipulate a variable on the server to indicate a purchase, if I wrap this in end-to-end encryption using AES 128, whatever I want to do, a symmetric algorithm, doesn't matter. That's not going to prevent this erroneous purchase from being sent to the server. So confidentiality, privacy, and availability really don't hold any water here. Finally, we have integrity. Okay, you could make an argument that an integrity check would only validate that the transaction was sent and received appropriately. That being said, what you could do, and I think that this is why this is the best answer, is you could implement sanity checks, right? Integrity checks on the purchase side, on the server purchase side. And you could say, only specific sets of transactions are allowed. And you could check, you could even have hashes of these transactions, right? Because you have specific formats that the application has to send that transaction request to the server in. And you could have integrity checks that validate whether this falls within the category of available transaction requests and could in fact result in reducing the number of erroneous purchases. So you might say, Travis, that's kind of a stretch. I agree that I'm stretching here a little bit, but I'm going to tell you this is the only one that would even allow us to stretch and make this assertion. And so while I agree that an integrity check or checking the integrity of the data might be a stretch in terms of the best security concept to prevent erroneous purchases. It is the only security concept in the given set of 4 answers here that would even apply in any meaningful way. And so while if you're in an exam environment and you're thinking this through and you're going, man, there really isn't a great option here, I agree. But if I have to choose the best option, which is basically what the question is saying here, then I have to choose an option that will give me a potential to identify erroneous charges and eliminate them, or erroneous purchases and eliminate them. And in this case, it's got to be answer C. There's really no other answer here that would allow us to do this with any degree of efficacy. Next question. In a secure communication system, it is essential to ensure that messages or transactions can be reliably attributed to the individuals who send them. This prevents users from denying their actions and provides verifiable proof of message origin and authenticity. Technologies and security mechanisms are implemented to achieve this level of accountability, ensuring that each message can be tracked back to its legitimate sender. Great, so we've got a lot of information to unpack here. It's very dense in terms of the terminology used. Communication systems, transactions and reliability, denying actions, verifiable proof, message origin, authenticity, security mechanisms, accountability, message tracing, legitimacy of sender, right? There's a lot going on here. Again, I need to go to the question to really determine what's valuable in this information. Which of the following security concepts enables the attribution of messages to individuals? So we're trying to attribute messages to individuals. Now we come down to the answers. First answer here, adaptive identity. Adaptive identity is an access control mechanism. Adaptive identity, although it's interesting, right? It does say adaptive identity. We're trying to identify users. If you didn't know what adaptive identity was, then you might have a problem here. Adaptive identity is actually an advanced access control mechanism. Basically adapting access controls based upon identity criteria. We'll go into this in more detail in identity and access management sections, but that's what that is. That does not apply to attributing messages to individuals. That applies to identifying individuals, identity and access management, but it doesn't apply to attributing messages to individuals. We'll go down. I'm going to try and eliminate as many questions as I can, answers as I can here. Access logs. Are access logs going to allow us to attribute messages sent to individuals? You might say, right, peripherally, you might go, well, Travis, if I knew that you had access to a system and then I knew that that system sent the message, then I could potentially attribute that to you. But realistically, we use access logs to audit users' actions, not this specific action, sending messages and attributing those messages to you. You could use it as a proxy, right? Basically, what that means is I could use it as a potential mechanism to identify you as the sender, and it is not a direct attribute of you as the sender. So a proxy means it's something that I can use to identify you in that way, but it is not the exact criteria that I would normally use. And so while we could use this as a proxy, it really isn't the best answer. And unless I came up with it, unless I went through these and said there isn't a great answer, unless I went through and said, hey, there's nothing good here, I could come back to this, and I would in a question in this way. But I know that that's not the case in this question, as I've reviewed these for them to present them to you. But I could come back to this, and I would, depending upon what the other answers were. Authentication. Authentication is authenticating users, identifying you as you, not you as the sender, but you as the user of the system, or you as the initiator of the information, right? So again, authentication is not attributing a message to you. It's how I identify you as you, right? Not through the context of messages sent. Finally, we have this concept of non-repudiation. And if you were following along with me here, or you've seen some of my previous videos, we've described non-repudiation in some of the older videos, right? Non-repudiation is the concept of attributing a message to you. It's actually the concept of the sender not being able to dispute that they sent it. Basically, if I were to send a message and say, oh, it actually wasn't me or my system that sent that message, the concept of non-repudiation is the exact concept that attributes that message to you and does not allow you to deny that message had been sent by you. So non-repudiation is actually precisely what is being described here. Ensure that messages or transactions can be reliably attributed to the individuals who send them. We are actually describing non-repudiation as a concept with a bunch of additional terminology to try and confuse you here. So the answer is non-repudiation, because that is actually a distinct description of the concept of non-repudiation in the question. let's change this a little bit. If non-repudiation didn't exist here, and now I said, what's the best answer from here? This is a really difficult question because there's a lot of concepts here, and it's very difficult to facilitate an answer. But I would still argue, if you remember, I said I would come back to access logs. If it were me and I wanted to attribute a message being sent to someone, adaptive identity is not going to allow me to do this. Authenticating users isn't going to allow me to do this. I would use access logs as a proxy. Right? I would go back and I would look at system access logs, and I would try to identify the sending system based upon some other attributes to the message. I would look at access logs in my system and infrastructure and determine who or what system was the sender and who or what was logged in, maybe an application or an individual, to have produced that message. So I would use access logs as a proxy. It is not the answer in this case because we have a best answer based upon the description and the answers that were available, and that's non-repudiation. So the answer is B, but I'd like to give you some variations of these questions because, variations show up. These have been some really valuable and interesting questions. I hope that you found them the same. As is always the case, engineer, break stuff, have fun. We'll see you for the next security topic. Let's go.